Internal Revenue Service IRS tax news. What someone should do if they missed the May 17th deadline to file and pay taxes. So if you or someone you know find yourself asking, when do I need to file my taxes by because I know they extended the deadline? Answer, yesterday, May 17th, which you would know if you were more closely following the channel here. Next question, what do I do now that I missed the deadline? I don't have the DeLorean from the Back to the Future, which probably no one remembers that movie, but can't go back in time is the point. What do I do now at this point since I missed the May 17th deadline and I still need to do something about that, I would assume. That's what we're addressing here. COVID tax tip 2021-69, May 18, 2021. The federal income tax deadline has passed for most individual taxpayers. However, some haven't filed their 2020 tax returns or paid their tax due. So that's the problem. Due date has now passed. Don't have the DeLorean to go back in time. Therefore, we need to do something from this time forward, and we missed the date. So what do? If an individual taxpayer is owed a refund, there's no penalty for filing late. On the other hand, tax owed and not paid by May 17, 2021 is subject to penalties and interest. So obviously they're more concerned about you if you didn't file the tax return and you owe them money. Because if they owe you money, you basically still kind of delayed the time period in which you would get the refund, and the IRS is not too upset with that. It's kind of like giving them a loan. They'll pay you later when you file the tax return. But if you owe them money, well then, wait a second. The IRS is like, wait a second. You got to pay us the money at the deadline. So that's when they want to see action being taken here. So if anyone who didn't file and owes tax should file a return as soon as they can and pay as much as they can to reduce penalties and interest. So in other words, even though you missed the deadline, you could still basically reduce the amount of penalties and interest by paying the tax. So the penalties and interest will, of course, go up the more that you have not paid the penalties and taxes. So there's two things that you're trying to avoid here, remember. One being the penalties and interest related to the late filing. So now because you missed the extension, you might have penalties related to that. And two, the penalties and interest related to the late payment. So obviously, if you owe money and the longer you owe the money, just like a loan, the interest will continue to accrue up and the penalties in a similar fashion may do the same type of thing. So the sooner that you take care of it, then, and that would obviously be why the incentive would try to set up the incentive structure this way, the sooner you pay them, the sooner you take care of the issue, file and pay the taxes owed, then the sooner the penalties and interest will stop to keep on accruing upwards. If you don't do that, then they'll continue to accrue typically. So electronic filing options, including Free File. There's still the IRS Free File option here. So you might be able to get access to the software, such as third-party software like an Intuit, TurboTax, and that type of thing. I believe it's still out there. They're still available on IRS.gov through October 15, 2021 to prepare and file returns electronically. So it looks like the government, I'm interpreting that as the government's kind of pressuring these third-party providers to allow that free option for people that have incomes below a certain threshold up until the extension date, it looks like, which is October 15th, 2021. So you could still basically, hopefully, get access to the free option if your income is such that you would qualify for that. So taxpayers should then review the payment options. There's a link to the payment options here. The IRS has information for taxpayers who can't pay taxes they owe. There's a link to that here. Now, remember, some people probably didn't file the taxes. If you owe money, especially if it's the first time you're going to file the taxes and you're like, I've never had to owe money before, possibly because you have gig work or Schedule C type of business that you haven't had before, and you know you're going to owe money, it can be daunting. And sometimes people just don't file the taxes at that point. Say, well, I'll do it later. I'll get to it later. And then, of course, you never get to it until it kind of accumulates upwards, possibly. That causes problems. So if you can't pay the taxes, then that's not what you want to do typically. You want to still file the tax return as soon as you can, pay the amount of taxes that you can pay, and then generally set up some type of payment agreement. You're usually going to be in a better situation if you are to do that. If you're in good standing with the IRS, if you're keeping communication with them, even if you can't pay, setting up a payment agreement is usually a fairly easy process. You don't even need to talk to anyone to do it. You could basically go online and look at the rules for the payment installment agreement in most cases. So some taxpayers may have extra time to file their tax returns and pay any taxes due. This includes disaster victims, taxpayers living overseas, certain military service members, and eligible support personnel in combat zones. So if you're in one of those groups and you haven't filed your tax return, then maybe you didn't miss the deadline. Maybe you don't need the DeLorean, which is the thing, the time machine car. Maybe you don't need that in order to be on time. And you don't need to take any extra steps, but just basically you still have time. That's what I'm trying to get at. So you can check out those categories here. There's links to those if you want to look at them. Filing soon is very important because the late filing and late payment penalties on unpaid taxes add up quickly. So the IRS is saying, hey, we're racking up, just like if you don't pay your credit card bill, interest starts to go up quite a lot after a while. Same kind of thing. You got a loan here. And you got the interest, which the interest is somewhat reasonable for the IRS, probably not as bad as a credit card that went out of control. But they also have the penalties that accrue up if you're not in compliance with the penalties. So you want to stop those. That's the goal. You want to stop the penalties and interest, stop the bleeding of the penalties and interest. And so action needs to be taken if action has not yet been taken. So, however, in some cases, taxpayers filing after the deadline may qualify for penalty relief. So notice that if you are in good standing with the IRS, meaning this is the incentive that, of course, the IRS would want to set up. If you keep communication with us, then, and we know what's going on, you're more likely to be able to waive some of the penalties and interest. So if it's a first-time thing, you haven't been able to pay before, and you basically file and whatnot, you might be able to then contact the IRS and say, hey, look, can I get a one-time waive of the penalty or something like similar to a credit card fee? Sometimes you get that first credit card fee and you call up the credit card and say, I will go somewhere else if you don't, and then they cancel the fee. Kind of like that with the IRS, even though you can't threaten to go anywhere else unless you want to move to another country or something. Probably pretty feeble threat, but still, they sometimes waive the fee if you're in good standing. That's the point. That's the point that I'm getting at. So for those charged a penalty, they can contact the IRS by calling the number on their notice and explain why they couldn't file and pay on time. Taxpayers who have a history of filing and paying on time often qualify for administrative penalty relief. See, they're going to say you've been in communication. We think you're honest with us. You're communicating. We're going to waive the fee possibly. So you're more likely to get that done in that case. So a taxpayer usually qualifies if they have filed and paid timely for the past 3 years and meet other requirements. For details, taxpayers should visit first-time penalty abatement page on IRS.gov. There's a link to that here. State filing and payment deadlines may be different than the federal deadlines. A list of state tax division websites is available through the Federation of Tax Administrators. There's a link to that here, and that's, of course, an important note. The states have their own tax obligations. They're supposed to be independent, from the IRS in order to be able to tax as they choose to meet the obligations of, the people in their state. But oftentimes they might mirror what's happening with the IRS, but you can't really depend on that. So you want to make sure that you're in compliance with whatever state requirements you have here. There's a link to that state tax division website if you want to check that out. And there's a link to this in the description